is up, everyone? Now, as of today, at the time of recording, it is officially October 30th, which is just one day before Halloween. Granted, I'm probably not going to get this video edited in time, but that's beside the point. But to celebrate this occasion, I thought it would be fun to talk about a genre that I've almost never discussed on this channel. Horror movies. My personal history with the genre is a bit of an unusual one because when I was younger, I hated the horror genre. I absolutely did not see the appeal. I hated movies that frightened me. I didn't find any enjoyment out of it. I found it extremely uncomfortable. And I just was utterly perplexed about why people would find a genre that actively tries to scare you appealing. And it wasn't until my mid to late teenagehood when I started watching them for myself when I finally started to understand why people in fact do like horror movies. It's a bit of an interesting transition because when I started this channel, I hated the genre so much that I seriously considered making a video that talks about a list of movies that I would never do. And horror movies were at the top of the list. And I very wisely did not make that video. And since I've recently gotten into the genre and I have a few decent horror movies under my belt, I thought why not share my personal taste in horror movies with you guys by talking about my top 10 favorites, which I thought would be more interesting than just reviewing one specific horror movie. And thus I'm bringing you this video today. Here are my top 10 favorite horror movies. But before we get started on the list, a few quick disclaimers. First off, I'm still relatively new to the genre and I don't watch horror movies very often because it's a genre I really have to be in the mood for. So I've only seen a small handful. And as such, there are going to be dozens of horror movies that I've heard excellent things about, but will not be on this list just because I have not seen them. Movies like Alien, The Exorcist, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Hereditary, Insidious, Wreck, Psycho, The Silence of the Lambs, Sinister, The Thing, and a bunch more that I can't think of at the top of my head. These are all horror movies that I've heard excellent things about, but I will not be putting them on this list because, as I just said, I have not seen them. There's also a bunch of movies that I absolutely love, however, I don't think they count as horror movies for one reason or another. Movies like Monster House, Coraline, Paranorman are all movies that I considered putting on the list, but decided against it since they're still technically kids' movies. They're basically horror movies for kids, but today I'm going to stick to traditional horror movies. This also applies to movies like Misery, a movie I absolutely loved, but you will not see it on this list because I consider that to be more of a thriller rather than a horror movie. And above all of that, there are other movies you won't see on this list like The Shining, because I don't like The Shining. And with that, I have one honourable mention, a horror movie I thoroughly enjoyed, but not just quite enough to justify putting it on this list, and that is James Wan's Lights Out. Lies! Lights Out is a movie that I loved purely just by the concept. It's scary, it's intense, it has some really clever, resourceful decisions made by the characters, and I just love the premise. It's a very short movie, but an entertaining one nonetheless. And with that, without further ado, here we go, my top 10 favorite horror movies. Number 10. It. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because the reason why It makes it onto the list is purely just for one reason, and that is it's thoroughly entertaining. It's one of those horror movies that I just find really entertaining because there's a great sense of adventure as they're trying to work out how to defeat this demonic clown. This is something that you're probably going to hear me say a couple of times throughout this video. However, I do think people do somewhat exaggerate just how scary this movie is, but again, that's probably just because of personal preference. I haven't seen the miniseries with Tim Curry, I definitely need to, but the 2017 movie is still a great ride. Bill Skarsgård is an absolute riot as Pennywise. I love the performances of the kids. I also love how it's got instantly iconic imagery, like its use of the single red balloon. I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but whenever I see a single red balloon out in the open, I immediately think of It. And I think that was very intentional. It's well shot, it's well acted, it's just a thoroughly entertaining movie. The only reason it's not higher on this list is because I just don't think there's that much else going for it, and it's not a movie I can see myself rewatching terribly often. It's a good movie and it's a really fun movie, but that's about it. Number 9. The Babadook. The Babadook, or as a lot of people seem to call it, the Babadook for some reason, is an excellent movie. Granted, I might be adding this movie to this list just out of bias because it's an independent Australian movie by a independent first-time film director, and I just think that's a really inspiring success story. But aside from that, it's still an excellent movie. It's really well shot, it has a really great, strong, oppressive atmosphere to it, which is incredibly fitting to the movie's theme about grief and depression. How both this mother and this son are dealing with a really horrible tragedy. The son has fully embraced and accepted this tragedy, but the mother is trying to ignore it. She's trying to pretend that it never happened and that it doesn't exist. And the more she tries to deny it, the more it's manifested into this demon that is the Babadook. And by letting her raw emotion bottle up inside her, she essentially is the Babadook. And that makes this movie 10 times more frightening than if it was just a single monster going to go boo in the night. I love this movie, and the only reason why it's not higher on this list yet again is because I don't think it's quite as scary as it could have been. And the main reason as to why is because of the Babadook itself. Because the Babadook is present in two ways: the book and the physical actual Babadook in the real world. Now the stuff with the book is absolutely spectacular. If the entire movie was focusing on just this book alone, it would probably be higher on the list. I love the idea how there could be this mystical fog, almost like this entity that can emerge from the darkness, like these images that you see in the book. It's all really great creepy imagery that gets under my skin. However, when we come to see the actual Babadook, it's just a guy in white makeup and a suit, and immediately I'm less frightened by it. I like how we don't see it terribly often and it relies more on sound and creepy atmosphere. However, I'm just not a fan of the design of the actual Babadook. They could have gone far scarier with that. Also, as excellent as it is, I really have to be in the mood to watch it. But that does not mean this is not a fantastic movie and it rightfully deserves a spot on this list. Number 8. The Cabin in the Woods. I'm trying to diversify my list a little bit, so there are going to be a couple of horror comedies in this list, but for a horror comedy, The Cabin in the Woods absolutely knocks it out of the park. What I love about The Cabin in the Woods, like a couple other movies on this list, is that it is a spectacular both tribute and parody to the entire horror genre. It breaks down and dissects the entire genre, a bunch of popular subgenres, and all of the tropes and cliches that we love and kind of hate. I also love its structure. I'll try not to spoil anything, but I love how the first half sets itself up as a very traditional horror movie with a few unsettling things going on in the background. A few things that just seem a bit odd or out of place for a movie of this genre. But then you get halfway through the movie and something happens. And once that thing happens, shit hits the fan, and it is glorious. Man, those last 30 minutes alone gave this movie a place on this list. I love the characters, I love its structure, I love the tone, and I kind of love the ending. It's also a great beginner piece since it dissects the entire genre. Granted, there's probably a bunch of jokes and references that you might not get if you're unfamiliar with it, but ultimately, if I was looking for horror movies to recommend to a beginner and a newcomer who's curious about the genre, Cabin in the Woods is one of the first movies I'd recommend they'd start with. It's a great movie, it's well paced, it has a great structure, it's entertaining, it's funny, and it's overall just a really fun ride. The Cabin in the Woods is one of the few movies on this list that I do recommend, even if you're not into horror movies. It's a great film. Number 7. Train to Busan. I unfortunately haven't seen that many foreign movies. Most that I can think of that I've seen at the top of my head are the first two Police Story movies and The Raid, and Chinese Zodiac, that one random movie by Jackie Chan. However, I definitely need to see a lot more of them. Train to Busan is the movie that I have seen the most recently before making this list, and I am so glad I decided to watch it before making this list. Train to Busan is an excellent movie. For those who don't know what this movie is about, it's a South Korean action horror movie about a zombie outbreak. And within this zombie outbreak, a father who has an estranged relationship with his daughter is desperately trying to take this train to get to the only safe place, and that is Busan. Unfortunately, one infected person makes it onto the train, and all hell breaks loose for the next 2 hours. It's action-packed, it's got some very intense suspenseful scenes, it takes full use of the train setting, it very clearly establishes that in a zombie outbreak, a train is one of the worst places you could be in because of the really tight and claustrophobic setting, and that allows for some really intense action sequences and some really suspenseful sequences. And the ending absolutely broke me. This is the first horror movie that almost brought me to tears. But it was such a great ending, and it's just such a great movie. I definitely need to see more foreign movies in general, because Train to Busan is one of the best ones I've seen so far. Number 6. Scream. Now, this movie and the next one I'm going to talk about, I had such a hard time trying to decide which to place because I love both of these movies. I love this one, I love the next one, and I was constantly switching back and forth on where I was going to put each of these movies. But even though I decided to give the next one the edge, Scream is still one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It is so good. It's another great example of a movie that balances both comedy and genuine horror. However, unlike what I've heard from some of the sequels, which I haven't seen, this one doesn't overdo the comedy. It's funny enough that it's a really great satire of the horror genre, but it's also got some genuine scares in it. I love the sense of humor, like Randy, his entire character is just one of my favorite characters in all of horror. And I love how this movie pokes fun at popular horror movie tropes, like having the protagonist criticize horror movie characters from running up the stairs before 2 minutes later, very hypocritically, running up the stairs. This is just a funny movie, and that little touch of comedy makes this movie really stand out from other slashers. It's not just a guy with a knife, it's a guy with a knife while also dissecting the tropes in popular horror movies. And I, for the life of me, cannot talk about Scream without talking about the first 12 minutes. The first 12 minutes alone would make an excellent short film. It's fun, it's lighthearted, and it very clearly establishes that these characters that we're going to be following are just like us because they know and love the same horror movies we do. However, once we get to a very certain line of dialogue in the first 12 minutes, the pen drops, and then the rest of the opening is filled with tension and suspense, and I absolutely love it. Scream is one of my favorite movies in the genre, and I would not forgive myself if I didn't add it to this list. But so is this next one that I'm going to talk about. Number 5. Child's Play. Again, I was really conflicted on whether I wanted to put this below or above Scream, but after thinking really hard about it, I just had to give Chucky the nudge. The only thing I gotta say about Child's Play, which I've said about a couple of horror movies on this list already, is that I think people really exaggerate just how scary this movie is. I really don't think it's that scary at all. That doesn't mean it's not one hell of a great movie though. I mean, this one movie alone has made Chucky one of the most iconic villains in all of horror. So iconic that he got his own cameo in Ready Player One, which is one of the funniest moments in the whole movie. The main reason Child's Play makes it to the list is not just because it's a really excellent movie all on its own, but also just because of Chucky himself. Chucky is not just a generic doll with a knife. He is also a character that has a lot of sass to him. He has a ton of personality, and a lot of that comes from the fact that he is possessed by a serial killer. A serial killer named Charles Lee Ray, who managed to do some voodoo and manifest his soul into this doll, which was a great plan. You could even say Charles had the greatest plan.
This is the greatest plan.
And that has resulted in Chucky being quite the wisecracker. And some of his dialogue throughout the entire series are absolutely golden. How's it hanging, Phil? Presto! You're dead. It's a long story. In fact, it's so long, if they were to make a movie about it, it'll take 3 or 4 sequels to do it justice. I've never felt so alive! Yeah, well, you've been alive for like 2 minutes. Now, obviously, Chucky himself is not the only reason this movie makes it to the list. The rest of the movie is just really, really well made. It's really well shot, it's really well produced. I absolutely love our protagonist, Andy Barclay. I'm not a huge fan of the whole trope about the mother not believing his son about these supernatural experiences, but this movie came out in 1988, if I recall correctly. And so the genre wasn't quite as widespread then as it is now. And so I can forgive it. And the execution of that specific trope really, really works in this movie. This is an excellent movie, and I'd feel stupid not putting it on the list. Number 4. 1408. Yeah, this is kind of where the unpopular opinions start to come in. I am not a fan of The Shining, but I absolutely love 1408. Both of these were by Stephen King, and the reason why I love 1408 so much more than The Shining is just because I think 1408's a lot scarier. I've seen this movie multiple times, and each time it is chilling, it is suspenseful, it is intense, and it is an excellent movie. One of the reasons I love this movie so much is purely because of the build-up, especially with the performance of Samuel L. Jackson, which in my opinion is Samuel L. Jackson's second best performance right behind Die Hard with a Vengeance. The way they built up the reputation behind this room, the fact that they won't let him book it until they legally have to, and the measures and the lengths that Samuel L. Jackson's character is going through in order to try to prevent him from staying in that room. He's trying to talk him out of it in every single way he can, by warning him, threatening him, bribing him, and everything he says about it gives you all the more tension when he finally goes into the room. Little things by like how Samuel L. Jackson says that he doesn't care if the protagonist dies, he just doesn't want to have to clean up the mess afterwards. And even after that, the build-up still gives you more of that tension and suspense, like how the air conditioning maintenance man refuses to enter the room and just gives him instructions from the door. Or how Samuel L. Jackson refuses to leave the elevator because nobody stays on that floor and he only enters the room once a month, and that's to do maintenance. And even little things like the little insert shot of the mechanism of the door lock as John Cusack unlocks the door. Also, John Cusack gives a brilliant performance here, and I love how this room forces him to grow as a character by forcing him to relive a terrible tragedy that he's trying to overcome. And that gives the movie a lot more depth. And it just goes to show you just how despicable this room is. Also, this movie has one of my favorite jump scares of all time. I absolutely love this movie, and it's by far one of my favorite horror movies, and I strongly recommend it if you haven't seen it. Number 3. Cube. You may or may not be surprised to see this movie on this list, but my third favorite horror movie is in fact Cube. Cube. One of my all-time favorites. Cube. That is why Cube works. I may have mentioned it once or twice, but the concept alone is one of the main reasons why this movie is so high on this list. I absolutely love the premise for this movie. A group of people are trapped in a maze of interlocking cubicle rooms, some of which contain lethal booby traps, and the group have to work with, or against each other, in order to get out. It's a brilliant concept that is executed wonderfully. This is one of the few movies that I have reviewed on my channel that I want to redo because my original review does not do this movie justice. There is so much going on under the surface that I didn't notice in my initial viewing that I really want to talk about. I absolutely love the premise, I love the set design, it's intense, it's suspenseful, and you really latch onto the characters. And what I love about the characters is that you not only get to root for them, but the characters play a huge contributing factor to this movie's major underlying theme about humanity. I want to redo my review for Cube, so I'm going to save a lot of the details for that video, but I absolutely love the characters within this movie. I love the premise, I love the characters, I love the set design. It's just an excellent movie. Number 2. Saw. Yeah, I'm aware that the Saw movies do have a reputation, and while I won't dispute that for the sequels, because the sequels do get pretty disgusting, but the reputation of the sequels is so over the top that a lot of people don't realize that the first movie is really not that bad. The gore is not that explicit, there's really not that much of it, and I'd even argue that it's not the most graphic movie on this list. At its core, this movie is about two guys, Adam and Gordon, who have to work together to escape this bathroom. However, this movie is extremely psychological because of this terrible moral dilemma that Dr. Lawrence Gordon has. And that is the fact he is given the task to kill Adam in order to save his family. And so Adam and Gordon spend most of the movie working together to work out how they can both escape this bathroom while still saving Gordon's family. And it's an extremely intriguing concept. Add that on top of a really compelling mystery on who Jigsaw is. Also, there are many elements of this movie that are just iconic. The cassette tapes, the TV messages, the reverse bear trap, Billy the puppet. Yes, the name of the puppet is Billy, not Jigsaw. Seriously though, I absolutely love this puppet's design. The design of the puppet is something that's really intimidating, but at the same time looks really, really cool. Honestly, this puppet is one of my favorite images in all of horror. Additionally, this movie is home to quite possibly my favorite plot twist of all time. It is shocking, it blew my mind, I did not see it coming, yet upon rewatch, it makes complete sense. And of course, I cannot talk about this movie without talking about Hello Zepp, which is one of my favorite movie scores of all time. It's so damn good. Ultimately, the reputation of the sequels is so over the top that I think this first movie is severely overlooked. Saw is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and I have absolutely no shame putting it at number 2. Number 1. Shaun of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead is an absolute masterpiece. And that is a word that I use to describe movies very, very sparingly. But that is a word I'm going to use to describe Shaun of the Dead along with the entire Cornetto trilogy. Because this, along with the other two Cornetto movies, those being Hot Fuzz and The World's End, are three of some of my absolute favourite movies of all time. Right up there next to Terminator 2 Judgment Day and Whiplash. And the only reason the other two movies aren't on this list is because they're not horror movies. I love Shaun of the Dead so much I even bought it in 4K, even though I don't own a 4K player. Mostly because locally this was the only way I could find the movie on Blu-ray. But I got it in 4K anyway, and I did that for all three movies in the Cornetto trilogy, because I love these movies that much. But out of the three, Shaun of the Dead is my favourite. Like a lot of other movies on this list, Shaun of the Dead is a great example of both a comedy and a horror movie, but at the same time it does lean a little bit more into comedy than some of the other movies on this list. But at the same time, the comedy works. The movie is really, really funny. And no, the fact that I find the movie absolutely hilarious is not the only reason the movie is at the very top of my list. The real reason why Shaun of the Dead makes it so high on my list is because every single detail matters. Every little thing in this movie, the slightest lines of dialogue, little tiny things going on in the background, seemingly have nothing going on about them, but they all play some sort of significant role. Shaun of the Dead is the only movie I can think of that manages to make a fart joke at the very start of the movie, and yet make the same joke at the end of the movie, and twist it into a heartbreaking moment. In fact, I could quote this movie for hours. It is such a good movie. God, that one scene where these people are fighting a zombie in perfect sync to Don't Stop Me Now by Queen is easily one of my favourite scenes in cinema.
Why is Queen still on? We have a situation! I know!
And that one scene was a great precursor to Baby Driver, another excellent film by Edgar Wright. There are so many great parallels, even little things going on in the background have significant meaning. The movie is just so rich and everything is just so cleverly woven in together that I want to study the hell out of this movie. But also, the movie is just thoroughly entertaining. It is just such a fun movie. I absolutely love Shaun of the Dead and I strongly recommend it. So those are my personal favourite horror movies, but what are yours? Please let me know in the comments below, stay tuned till my next video, but until then, see you later.